Which to, sir?
Oh, God.
All right, before you start the tape, all right, what we're trying to do in addition is the idea of giving you the history of the organization is to help you understand, first of all, how the union came about and why, some of the decisions that you've heard rumors about in the field, sick-outs, strikes, deals that were cut, and everything like that. Hopefully, after you hear, you'll have a better understanding of why we did certain things and how it came about and why we lost some of the wars and some of the wars we won. In addition, it'll help you explain to your membership. It'll explain to your membership some of the background and some of the decisions of the union. And we're open to suggestions when you get back. If you have the time, you want to sit down and write us a few lines or letters with constructive criticism, things that you think should be in or should be out of it in history, we'd appreciate it. You want to start anytime you're ready. What I'd like to do first is go back a little bit of history of air traffic control to give you some kind of a background of how ATC system came about, and then we'll lead into the beginning of the union, and I'll take you up almost to today, from the beginning of PATCO. By the way, it's ironic. Tomorrow is January 11th. I believe today is the 10th. And that would be our 11th anniversary of our first meeting of the union, where we had our original membership meeting in New York. Welcome to the class, Dr. Grasso. I think he's the oldest living controller in the United States.
Yeah, not too cool, this one.
Actually, the FAA, as you know it today, was started in 1938 as the Department of Commerce. And with very few air traffic control facilities in the country, aviation was just starting, and we entered the Second World War. After the war, aviation was now to the country. They were carrying the mails, etc. And the airlines started to organize. They organized the first air traffic control center out in Newark, New Jersey. They ran the system because of the military concept. Everybody that came into the CAA that was put into ATC portion of it was ex-military. The management officials were ex-officers from the Air Force or the Navy. The air traffic controllers primarily were ex-pilots or navigators or bombardiers from the Second World War. They set up the CAA, or the FAA as you know it today, under the military concept. The management was the general. The air traffic controller would be your frontline troops, and the trainees that were coming into the system, they were considered boots. And the trainee was the lowest of the low. He was lower than a pregnant ant. It's hard to realize, but as far back as in the 1960s, the early 1960s, in some of the facilities around the country, trainees were not allowed to sit at the same table and have coffee with a journeyman controller. You had segregated cafeterias where there was a cafeteria. Parking lots were segregated. The bosses would park next to the building, the journeymen behind the bosses, and the trainees out in the boondocks. As aviation was starting in its concept in the beginning there, we went into the Korean War. And that is really when the ATC system started to boom. After the Korean War, about 1955, 1956, as the war was winding down in Korea, civilian aviation started to boom. And they were hiring thousands of air traffic controllers. They were building or placing ATC facilities in old government hangars, old GSA buildings. And really the ATC system as you know it today started in the middle 50s. And what you had was maybe 8,000 air traffic controllers, 99 and 9/10% were ex-military into the system. The equipment that we used was primarily military equipment was ripped off aircraft carriers. That was your first radar concept in the civilian system. Ex-Air Force radar. 99% of the entire system was run on a non-radar basis. What you know today as ATP, we used to call it ANC. The first jet aircraft that come in was only in the early 60s. But as aviation was booming, the federal government and the civilian population and the Congress had no concept, was not even aware what an air traffic controller was, that they even existed. There was no money funded from Congress to buy the equipment that was needed or fund the hiring of air traffic controllers. And that's the way we went along. 1956, I think, is probably the first time an air traffic controller came out into the press or into the public's eye. And that was because we had a mid-air collision. You had the Grand Canyon crash, Transworld Connie, I believe it was, and a DC-7. A mid-air collision where many lives were lost. This started the beginning of the public. Even the pilots at that time had no idea or conception what a controller was doing. So Congress, because of the hue and cry, what the hell was happening out in the goddamn system with a mid-air collision, they started to give the FAA or the CAA a few dollars to buy some equipment and hire a few more air traffic controllers. In 1958, we had another influx of monies from the Congress, and that's primarily because we had another mid-air collision, an Air Force jet, DC-7, over Las Vegas. Once again, the name or the nomenclature of an air traffic controller surfaced into the newspapers, into the NTSB investigations, and people started to say, hey, what's going on? Congress had an investigation, and from that, the FAA was born. In 1958, the Congress passed the Act, the Aviation Act, which made the birth of the FAA as you know it today. The first administrator of the FAA was General Quesada out of the military. The same concept. The military was going to run the aviation system around the FAA. He set it up with the general, who he was himself. His lieutenant generals were the regional directors. He had colonels as the area managers. And then you had your captains and lieutenants, which would relate to your chief and your ACs and watch supervisors and team supervisors. And the controllers, as I said before, were the troops, and the trainees were the boots that were coming in. The equipment was obsolete. The jet age was coming upon us. We had no, what you call flow control today. It was unheard of. There was no such thing as coordination. You went to work in an atmosphere of you arrived at work, you were in a hold, you worked for 8 hours or 10 hours without getting relieved. We did not have cafeterias or anything like you have today. You ate on the position if you were given the time. If you had a coffee break, you had your coffee right at the position. A trainee's function was to take the coffee orders and the sandwich orders and bring them to the journeyman controllers. Trainees were not even allowed to talk to journeymen practically. The main function of a trainee was to service the journeyman controllers with coffee and sandwiches. And once in a while, in between his serving the lunch and everything, he was to get trained and post strips. It was complete chaos throughout the system. There was no such thing as radar handoffs, as you know it today. You would terminate the aircraft if you had radar and turn them over to another facility or another sector. Most of your sectors were not even radar. So you would go, an aircraft would take off, for instance, Kennedy, go into a radar environment of a departure sector, which would last about 12 or 13 minutes, and then he'd be transitioned into an ATP sector. and maybe he'd go ATP for half his flight, and then another center might have a radar sector, and you go back into radar separation. And you can imagine the chaotic conditions with this type of operation. The landlines, we had loudspeakers. Everybody is screaming and yelling. You have to go into an old center or a busy approach control to really appreciate it. It was like an insane asylum. You went to work, the air traffic controller, your whole thing was to survive that day. Fuck anybody in the other sectors as long as I didn't run them together today and get caught. And we had near-mid-air collisions by the dozens, but nobody reported them. The bosses didn't want them reported. The controller certainly was not going to report it, because if you reported it in those days, it was written up, you were suspended or fired. So everybody was protecting their young asses by not reporting it. The only thing that was ever reported was when the pilot officially filed a complaint. Then we would have to file some type of paperwork. Normally what you would do is the pilot would call on a telephone, and you get on a telephone and plead at the mercy of the court, or lie to him and say it wasn't your fault, it was his fault, and put a doubt in his mind whether he was right or you were right, and come to a nice gentleman's agreement that nobody's going to file, so nobody would get in trouble. And this perpetuated itself. The big FAA management in Washington, they never went out in the field, they never were in the facilities. All they would get was these sweet, beautiful reports from their chiefs in their area. Everything is going smooth. Look at our track record. We have no incidents, no mid-air collisions. We're running a damn good system. With that type of information being fed into national Washington FAA, it also was being fed into the Congress. And every year you have appropriations would come around. The FAA, instead of asking for more money, they, to make themselves, because they are political animals at the higher element of the FAA, to make themselves look good with the Congress, they would turn back money that was allotted to them the year or 2 years before by the Congress to buy new radar or hire new controllers. But they wanted to be heroes, and they would give it back to the Congress because everything was running so smooth. Well, that bubble really burst in 1963 when we had the biggest mid-air collision in the United States over Brooklyn, New York, a United jet and a Trans-World Connie, and it came out into the press, the national television. Congress had special investigations. We had 132 people killed. What they did, they found out that the FAA had not hired any new controllers for a couple of years. They had no equipment. As they cross-examined the air traffic controllers and the bosses that were involved in the crash, they started to find tremendous loopholes in the entire system. So Congress then, and they seem to react, the beast that they are, after a catastrophe, they allotted more money to get more air traffic controllers. At that time, just about in every major facility in the country, the air traffic controllers were working 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, because we had no backups. There's no overtime. The overtime that we had in those days was from the 9th, after the 8th hour. You worked the 10th, the 9th, and the 10th, and your extra day on Saturday or your 6th day, you worked for less money than you worked for straight time. Because of the regulations of the civil service, you could only get paid as a time and a half for a GS-9. To compound the fact, we have a reclassification problem today. The radar controllers in the centers were GS-11s. The radar controllers and the approach controllers were GS-12s. And that did not lend itself to harmony between the terminal controllers and the center controllers. The center controllers considered all the terminal controllers, and I mean all, a bunch of assholes, overpaid, and vice versa. The centers was the pits. Nobody wanted to go into a center. If you got into a center, you never got out. And they were dirty, stinking, old little buildings. the dust would be coming down. And because we were under the military concept, we used to have to wear white shirts with our little skinny ties, right? You weren't allowed to wear colored shirts. You had to have a white shirt. And you'd report to work, and if you were a trainee, they might give you a mop. Tell you to wear a tie and a white shirt, but they wanted you to mop the floors, clean up the ashtrays, go out and wash the ashtrays. A truck would come and deliver strip holders. The trainees would go down and unload the truck and carry up the cartons into the facilities. And at the same time, they'd tell them you come to work with a white shirt and tie. If you came in with a colored shirt, they'd send you home and charge you 8 hours annual leave. And this was through the entire system. If you defied a boss, you were fired. There was no unions. There was no such thing as a grievance procedure. They had certain regulations in the civil service that were never told to you. If you had a medical disqualification, you just cracked up on the position. They just took you off the position. They sent you home, and you got a letter saying you were dismissed from the FAA because you couldn't check out anymore. Nobody came around and told you, hey, you might be eligible for medical retirement, or you might be eligible for FEC claims. If you got sick, you were finished. If you got a couple of deals in a row, you were finished. Out the door. Get yourself a new job. And it was a beautiful system they had. Everybody was terrified of losing their job when you came to work. If you got sick, you were afraid to tell the management because you know you'd lose your job. We could go to your own doctor and take your physical. You didn't have to go to the FAA doctors in those days. So your own doctor would cover up your illness if you were friends with him. And this was rampant throughout the entire system. The FAA knew about it, but they didn't want anybody to know, and they let it go on because it was cheaper for them. Because if you went out on a BEC or an FEC claim, that money comes out of the FAA's budget. And it would cost them millions, which it has after we learned about it in 1970. But it has cost them millions since then. We then had a freeze. There was a 3 or 4 year period where no trainees were hired. And this started the building up of almost of a revolution. You were on your 6 days, like I explained before, you're 10 hours a day, and then the sick leave would come in because you can only take that for so long. I don't know if you've ever been in that environment of working 6 days a week, 10 hours a day for a long, prolonged period of time. You just can't hack it, not in this type of business. So you start to take sick leave. Then you come to work sometime, maybe in a terminal, there's supposed to be 30 journeyman controllers on duty between the cab and the radar room. 15 would be there, because the other 15 were out on sick leave. So it was compounding. We were doubling up the sectors. If you complained, off the sector. And then they had another little trick, which they still use to an extent, but I believe it's a little bit less than it was in those. There was peer pressure. If you asked for help, you were an asshole. They built it into you. Pride. The first person, the first controller that was starting to go down the pipe that asked for help, all the other guys made fun of him. He was a shitbird. So you'd go there and choke. You go down the tubes rather than ask for help. Because when you started to wise up and you asked for help, there was no help anyway. God forbid if you stopped departures or arrivals. There was no such thing as flow control. You just took every airplane that you could. Then you lost the picture. It was complete chaos. Only for the grace of God, we didn't have scores of mid-air collisions. They had A and C holding patterns that we found out when the radar was starting to put in. They were overlapping each other at the same altitude, holding for years. But this is what you had going in there. What did the controllers do about it? Well, I'll tell you what we did about it. We sat around the coffee shops and bullshitted and complained. Because if you did it officially, you were gone. There was no such thing as a union. We had in those days, for an example, an association. It was called ATCA, the Air Traffic Controllers Association. When you went in, if you were hired and you were sent to Oak City, they would play a tape of an ex-Senator Monroney, who used to be a senator, who somehow was hired by ATCA as a consultant or the general counsel, something like that. And he said, if you join ATCA, we're going to get you 20-year retirement and solve all your problems. And the instructor that was instructing you, who was going to pass or fail you, whether you're going to have a job, he had an ATCA emblem on his lapel, and he'd come around and say, you joining or not? So naturally, air traffic controllers being smart, you would join in Oklahoma City. Then you get back to the facilities, and after a year or two, you'd realize what ATCA was all about, and most of the controllers would quit. However, some of the areas of the country kept ATC alive because it was the only thing there. It was better than nothing. That was what we thought anyway. ATCA was run by management. Bill Fleener, he was the key man in ATCA. All your officers that ran that association were management officials. I believe the only air traffic controller, journeyman controller, that ever served in an official capacity of ATCA on a high level, sort of like a counselor, they used to call him in those days, of the executive board, our equal, was John Lapine out of New York Center, who now works at with PATCO. But the rest were all management officials. They would have a convention once a year. You'd gather up. There'd be about 90% management, 10% air traffic controllers. The controllers would raise some objections on the floor of the convention, make a couple of complaints. They were silenced. They'd all have their cocktails. If you were a good boy and behaved at the convention, and you went back to your facility, the next bid for a boss job, you could expect it. If you made noise at the convention or at one of their meetings criticizing the FAA, your ass was grass. You was a shitbird. So naturally, under that condition, you didn't make too much noise. I remember one controller, New York Center, he came out of. His name was Bernie Razon. He's a management official now in Central Flow Control. He had the audacity to go to a meeting of pilots and stand up before the meeting and make some constructive criticism of the way the ATC system was running, about air traffic control and the dangers involved, safety issues. Well, he was given papers, proposed dismissal. And this was off the job on his own time. So there was a deal worked out finally where he was forced to transfer from New York to Washington Center to get him out of there. He was a militant. He was one of the first guys that I know of that was publicly declared a militant. Then in 1962 came a break. John F. Kennedy signed the executive order which allowed unions to come into the federal sector, allowed unions to negotiate on a partial basis, and allowed the employees to join the union with protections and also dues checkoff. When you started into the FAA then, you had the National Association of Government Employees, NAGE. They started to organize within the controllers. You had IAM into the southwest part of the country. You had the National Federation of Federal Employees started to organize in the northeast, Atlantic City area, and a couple of other so-called unions. You had a philosophy fight. Most of us, or most of them, I like to say, did not like unions. I happen to come from an environment that was more union-oriented. But most of the air traffic controllers around the country did not like to be called a unionist, did not like the concept of a union. They liked professional societies. And they wanted to be considered professionals, and they felt that if you belonged to a union, you would not be a professional. So you had this fight of the Association of Air Traffic Controllers versus the union concept that was starting to creep into the FAA. And then we had our own parochial type of environment. For an example, on the West Coast, you had the Los Angeles Controllers Association. In Kennedy, you had the John F. Kennedy Controllers Association. In the New York Center, you had the ATCA plus the NAGE union starting to come in. You'd go out to Minneapolis, was NAGE. You go to the Southwest and the South, they were either no union whatsoever. If they joined anything, it was ATCA. But you mention union in the South and the Southwest, and they'd faint on you. The Midwest, primarily the Chicago area, was all ATCA or nothing. The Washington area was a little bit of NAGE, a little bit of ATCA, and the vast majority was nothing. The West Coast, you had the Los Angeles terminal concept of their own association. Out in the Palmdale Center, they started NAGE. Various terminals picked up IAM, some picked up NFFD, and some just didn't do nothing. We were not allowed the FAM trip like you know it today. If you took a FAM trip, you took 2 a year, I believe it was, then you had to return within 24 hours, and then they expanded it to 48 hours. So therefore, this was a put-down of communicating with other controllers, finding out what they were doing around the country. And very rarely you knew anything about the other facilities. You didn't want to know. They were all a bunch of shitbirds wherever they worked. The facility that you were in were the greatest controllers in the world, and you were the most depressed. Your problems were all different. We were all unique. We still have that type of thinking, I think, in a lot of facilities, that my facility is unique. They made a great stride forward when they made the radar controllers in the centers. After about 3 or 4 years of bitching and refusing to give the tower clearances and radar handoffs, they upgraded the radar controllers to GS-12s. By the way, when we went in the system, I'm not that old. I started in 1958. Our salary as a trainee, you went as a 6, was $4,050. Journeyman controller, when we started PATCO in 1968, was approximately $12,500. That was the pay scale. We had no retirement. As you know it today, your retirement was 30 years, age 55 with the civil service. No journeyman controller ever reached 55. You were out, brother. You were either a babbling idiot in a nut house, medical disqualification, or you became a boss. That was the only way out. We didn't have no living 55-year-old air traffic controllers. It was to save the government a lot of money. You would work for them for about 7 to 10 years. Then you get the shakes, get sick, out the door. I didn't have to give you no retirement because I didn't tell you about your medical benefits. I didn't tell you anything about what was coming to you. The bosses themselves didn't know because nobody told them. But that's a little bit what you had. In 1968, this is how the beginning of your union got started, PATCO. There was a group of air traffic controllers in Atlanta and Chicago who believed that they were the hardest working air traffic controllers in the system and that they deserved more money than the rest of the controllers around the world or around the country. So they got together and they come up with a plan which they called Operation Snowman. And it's very similar to what we had just a few years ago, the reclass. They come up with a formula of reclassifying all the controllers around the country. And ironically, the way their formula come out, the Atlanta controllers and the Chicago controllers, they were going to be the highest paid controllers in the country. And then the New York controllers, and maybe we'll throw in LA and a couple other places, you'll be next and down the line. So they needed some help, and they were going to be very daring. They were going to get a petition and have all the controllers in the country sign the petition and mail it to the administrator. And this was going to pressure the government into giving us our upgrades. So they needed the help of other areas of the country to sign this petition, because this was the tremendous clout we were going to have, then the government was going to bend over and surrender and give us an upgrade. They had a meeting up in Newark, New Jersey. And what they did, is they asked the eastern part of the country to send a representative from your facility to hear their great plan, their formula, and try to get some backing from the various places. I happened to be a NAGE member and the local president at LaGuardia at the time. Jack Marr was the local president of the New York Center for NAGE. Kennedy Controllers had a president who was the president of the Kennedy Controllers Association. The Newark Controllers they were ATCA, and they sent their representative to the meeting, and I believe there was a fellow from Philadelphia came down. And we met with the group from Chicago and Atlanta, and they explained their formula, et cetera, and we told them we think their formula sucks, that controllers in New York should be ahead of the controllers in Atlanta, and the arguments started who was working harder and complexity and the same arguments we have today. So being reasonable men, we cut a deal with them. They agreed that they would raise the New York controllers equal to the Atlanta controllers and Chicago controllers. We cut a deal, we signed their petition. Now this was the first time that any group from various facilities in that part of the country had ever got in the same room and talked to each other. The way it was, if you were you never talked to the other facility. There were a bunch of assholes, and if you met them in the bar, you'd end up an hour later punching out each other. So during this meeting, we started to, shoot the breeze, buy a few drinks, and it started to come out that they had the same problems in Kennedy and Newark, in the center, and in Atlanta and Chicago that we had in LaGuardia, and vice versa. And the more we talked, the more we realized that our problems were exactly the same. We had a couple of minor differences, however, the major problems were the same. The working conditions, the retirement, the pay, the lack of a grievance or appeals procedure, a lack of knowledge that was given to us by management, the doubling up of positions, the overtime problems. So on the way home, I happened to be carpooling with Jack because I didn't have a car in those days. I couldn't afford one. And Jack was going to drive me home. And we started talking. And we agreed, hey, we do have the same problems. What we ought to do more often is get together and try to come up with a united front on some of these problems and try to get something done. We also decided that we're going to form an association. And we call it the Metropolitan Controllers Association. And that was a group of New York Center, Kennedy Tower, Newark Tower, and LaGuardia. And politics right away entered the association. So in order not to break up the association, we cut a deal. We draw out of the hat who was going to be chairman of the association. If it was the center, Jack would be chairman for a month. Then next month somebody else would be, it was a rotate chairmanship, because we didn't want to split and have a vote, because it would have ended up 3 terminals versus the center, and the terminal guy was a lock, because we hated those center guys. So this was the first, in that part of the country, an association of a group of facilities that got together. We then decided that, hey, what we need is an entire national organization with all the controllers belonging to the same, whether it's going to be a group or a society or a union, whatever it might be. But the key to this was get everybody to join the same group. So we sent a delegation which consisted of Jack Marr and a fellow named Stanley Gordon, who happened to be the treasurer of the New York Center Union at the time. And we always, in the concept back there, that you had to be Jewish to be a treasurer. If you weren't Jewish, you couldn't be a treasurer. We sent them up to a meeting with the president of the National Association of Government Employees, NAGE, Ken Lyons. And we laid out this concept. We said, listen, you're a massive union. You have approximately, they claimed they had 200,000 members, and they represented shipyards and schools and cops and firemen and everybody. What we need is a special group within NAGE, strictly air traffic controllers, and you should provide us a full-time employee to concentrate strictly on air traffic controllers. Because what was happening is we, as officers in age would call them. They would never get back to us. They would do nothing. All they did was collect our dues from the dues checkoff. They didn't even bother negotiating contracts for us. So Ken Lyons told us that no, the air traffic controllers, first of all, to provide that, we'd have to have a dues increase. At that time, I think we were paying $2 a payday, and that we needed a dues increase of almost doubling, up to $4 a payday. And the air traffic controllers were a bunch of cheap bastards, and they'd never go for it, and you got a shitty idea, and they sent Jack and Stanley home. Put them on a little plane from Boston, back down to New York, and the association got together, and Jack gave us the report that they wouldn't buy it. So we decided that we were going to start something on ourselves, without an age. We gave them the chance, and they rejected it, and we're going to take a shot.